History has no shortage of disastrous kings, queens, and other rulers. Such a list could easily have been filled with the worst Roman emperors alone. Some have been homicidal, like Nero or Genghis Khan, simply incompetent, like Edward II, completely untrustworthy, like Charles I, or amiable but inadequate, like Louis XVI of France or Tsar Nicholas II. But who are truly the worst of the worst and why? From maniacal medieval monarchs to Habsburg horrors, today we make the case against the worst kings, queens, and various other leaders from across history. There are plenty of other contenders for worst Roman emperor, Nero and Commodus for example, but Caligula's mad reign sets a high standard. After a promising start to his reign, he seems to have set out specifically to intimidate and humiliate the Senate and high command of the army, and he gave grave offense, not least in Jerusalem, by declaring himself a god. Even the Romans normally only recognized deification after death. Caligula instituted a reign of terror through arbitrary arrest for treason, much as his predecessor Tiberius had done. It was also widely rumored that he was engaged in incest with his sisters and that he lived a life of sexual debauchery, and this may well be true. The story of his making his horse a consul, meanwhile, may have been exaggerated, but it was not out of character. Caligula's unforgivable mistake was to jeopardize Rome's military reputation by declaring a sort of surreal war on the sea, ordering his soldiers to wade in and slash at the waves with their swords, and collecting chests full of seashells as the spoils of his victory over the water god Neptune, king of the sea, and by his failed campaign against the Germans, for which he still awarded himself a triumph. He was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard in AD 41. Even by the lax standards of the medieval papacy, John XII stands out as a disaster of the highest order. He was elected pope at the ripe old age of 18 as part of a political deal with the Roman nobility, and he inherited a conflict for control of Italy between the papacy and the Italian king Berengarius. John had the support of the powerful German Emperor Otto I, who swore to defend John's title, but John himself was too taken up with a life of drunken sex parties in the Lateran to care too much either way. He recovered from his hangover enough to accept Otto's oath of undying loyalty and then promptly linked up behind Otto's back with his enemy, Berengarius. Understandably annoyed, Otto had John overthrown and accused, among other things, of simony, clerical corruption, murder, perjury, and incest, and he replaced him with a new pope, Leo VIII. However, John made a comeback and had Leo's supporters punished ruthlessly. One cardinal had his hand cut off, and he had a bishop whipped. Full-scale war broke out between John and Otto, until John unexpectedly died, in bed with another man's wife, or so rumor had it. The reign of King John is a salutary reminder that murder and treachery may possibly be forgiven in a monarch, but not incompetence. John was the youngest and favorite son of Henry II, but he had not been entrusted with any lands and was mockingly nicknamed John Lackland. He tried unsuccessfully to seize power while his brother Richard I was away on crusade and was sent into exile upon Richard's return. On his accession, John had his own nephew Arthur murdered, fearing Arthur might pursue his own, much better, claim to the throne, and he embarked on a disastrous war with King Philippe Auguste of France in which he lost the whole of Normandy. This singular act of incompetence deprived the barons of an important part of their power base, and he alienated them further with arbitrary demands for money and even by forcing himself on their wives. Unlike Richard III, Richard II has good reason to feel grateful towards Shakespeare, who portrayed this startlingly incompetent monarch as a tragic figure, a victim of circumstances and of others' machinations rather than the vain, self-regarding author of his own downfall he actually was. Learning nothing from the disastrous precedent of Edward II, Richard II alienated the nobility by gathering a bunch of cronies around him and then ended up in confrontation with Parliament over his demands for money. His reign descended into a game of political maneuver between himself and his much more able and impressive uncle, John of Gaunt, before degenerating into a gory grudge match between Richard and the five lords appellant, whom he either had killed or forced into exile. Richard might have redeemed himself by prowess in war or administration, but he possessed neither. Henry Bolingbroke's coup of 1399, illegal though it no doubt was, brought to an end Richard's disastrous reign. Richard II has his defenders nowadays, who will doubtless take issue with his inclusion in this list, but there really is very little to say for him as a ruler. Prince Ivan Vasilievich grew up at the hazardous court of Moscow, his life often in danger from the rivalry of the boyars, nobles. It gave him a lifelong hatred of the nobility and a deep streak of ruthless cruelty. Aged 13, he had one boyar eaten alive by dogs. Ivan was Prince of Muscovy from 1533, and in 1547 he was crowned Tsar, Emperor, of all Russia, the first ruler to hold the title. He crushed the boyars, stealing their lands to give to his own followers. He also condemned millions of Russians to a permanent state of serfdom. Ivan took a vast area of Russia as his personal domain, patrolled by a mounted police force with carte blanche to arrest and execute as they liked. Distrusting the city of Novgorod, he had it violently sacked and its inhabitants massacred, and he embarked on a disastrous and ultimately unsuccessful series of wars with Russia's neighbors. Ivan beat up his own pregnant daughter-in-law and killed his son in a fit of rage. Ivan was in many ways an able ruler, but his ruthlessness, paranoia, and taste for blood earned him his place in this list. We are so familiar with the drama and tragedy of Mary, Queen of Scots' reign, that it is easy to overlook the blindingly obvious point that she was absolutely useless as Queen of Scotland. Admittedly, ruling 16th-century Scotland was no easy task, and it was made harder still for Mary by the stern Presbyterian leader, John Knox, and her violent, boorish husband, Lord Darnley. Nevertheless, Mary showed none of her cousin Elizabeth I's political skill in defusing religious or factional conflict, and she headed into pointless confrontation with Knox and the Presbyterians. At a time when female rule was generally regarded with suspicion in any case, she played up to the stereotype by appearing to live in a cozy world of favorites, including her unfortunate Italian guitar teacher, David Rizzio. Mary's suspected involvement in the spectacular murder of Darnley on February 10, 1567, was a political mistake of the first order. Her marriage 3 months later to the main suspect, the Earl of Bothwell, was an act of breathtaking stupidity. It is hardly surprising that the Scots overthrew Mary and locked her up. Having escaped, she was mad to throw away her advantage by going to England, where she could only be regarded as a threat, instead of to France, where she would have been welcomed with open arms.